The smell hit first, high and sharp in the frozen air. A smell of rot trying to fight its way through the cold. It was the smell of a promise broken, of fat turning sour and meat giving up its ghost. The German shepherd at her side lifted its heavy head, a low rumble starting in its chest. The woman placed a wide, steady hand on the dog's neck, and the sound ceased. She did not need the dog to tell her something was wrong. The stillness of the neighbor's hogs, usually a chorus of grunts and squeals, was a sound louder than any noise. She pulled her wool shawl tighter, her breath pluming in the weak morning light. Her own cabin was a small, dark square against the endless white of the new snow, smoke rising from its stone chimney in a straight, unwavering line. She moved through the snow, her considerable weight packing it down with each deliberate step. The dog, Kaiser, walked at her heel, his paws making no sound. At the fence line of the next homestead, she saw it. A sow, stiff and bloated on its side, its legs pointing at the indifferent sky. Another lay near the trough, a dusting of fresh powder failing to hide the stillness. A deep, wasting cold had come in the night, a false thaw followed by a killing freeze. It had cracked the earth and, it seemed, the beasts themselves. Water in the troughs had frozen solid, and the poorly stored grain had turned to ice-hard clumps. The men of the settlement had laughed at her preparations, their eyes sliding over her broad frame as she hauled stone and split timber. They called her the burrowing woman. They said her husband's passing had cracked her wits. Now their hogs were dead, and their laughter was frozen in the silent air. She looked at the ruin for a long moment, her face revealing nothing. Then she turned and walked back to her cabin, the dog a dark shadow beside her. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The cold was a patient enemy. It took the careless first. Her husband, Abram, had been a man who understood the earth. He had felt the turn of the seasons in his bones, a sense deeper than any almanac. The ground keeps things honest, Martha, he'd said, his voice already thin with the sickness that would take him. It holds the cold in summer and the memory of warmth in winter. He had started the work himself, clearing the space beneath the cabin's floorboards. He'd barely gotten the trapdoor framed before the coughing took his strength. After the funeral, after the neighbors had delivered their thin condolences and thinner casseroles, she had taken up his shovel. The work was a kind of prayer that required no church. She did not weep. She did not pray. She dug. The earth was hard-packed clay and stone, a stubborn refusal beneath the thin topsoil. Her hands, wide and chapped, bled. Her back, broad and strong, ached with a fire that burned through the nights. The dog would lie at the edge of the hole, watching her with intelligent, worried eyes as she descended the ladder into the growing dark. She hauled the dirt out bucket by bucket, piling it near the woodline where it would not be seen. The neighbors saw the smoke from her chimney, saw her tending her small flock of chickens, and assumed she was sinking into a widow's grief. They did not see the hollowing out that was also a building. She lined the walls with flat field stones Abram had collected, fitting them together with a mortar of clay and sand. It was slow, punishing labor. Each stone set was a memory of his hands. Each smoothed patch of mortar was a conversation she could no longer have. She was not digging a hole. She was building a vault for his last promise, that she would outlast the winter. That she would outlast all of them. When it was done, the cellar was 10 feet deep and 12 feet square, colder than any icebox, smelling of damp earth and stone and resolve. The new pine shelves she'd planed and fitted herself lined 3 walls, raw and pale in the lantern light. It was a silent, defiant space, sealed beneath the floor of a house where she was utterly alone. She filled it methodically. The harvest from her garden went down first. Potatoes, turnips, and carrots were buried in crates of dry sand. Onions and garlic hung in braided ropes from the ceiling beams. The shelves held rows of green beans, pickled beets, spiced apples, and pears, each sealed in a glass jar with a wax top, the light from her lantern turning them into a wall of dark jewels. She had traded her best laying hens for 20 pounds of salt, and used it to cure hams and long sides of bacon, which now hung from iron hooks next to the garlic. Sacks of flour, cornmeal, and beans were stacked on a low wooden platform to keep them off the floor. Salt pork, lard in stone crocks, wheels of hard cheese wrapped in wax cloth. A small clay jar of honey. She didn't go to church, didn't gossip at the general store, didn't beg for help or company. She worked. Her self-sufficiency was an affront to the settlement's fragile order, a place where women were meant to be reliant. Her size, which should have been an asset in a land that valued strength, was instead a source of crude jokes. Rector, the settlement's self-appointed leader, would tip his hat to her, a smile on his face that never reached his eyes. Still digging to China, Mistress Martha, he'd ask, his tone pitched for the men around him to hear. She would just nod, her gaze steady, and continue on her way. Her silence unnerved them more than any argument could. They mistook her preparations for madness, her quiet for weakness. They did not understand that grief had burned away everything in her that was not essential. And what was left was iron. The cold kept what the earth gave. The blizzard arrived not with a roar but a whisper. It started as a graying of the sky, a slow erasure of the horizon. Then the first flakes, fine and dry as dust, began to fall. By dusk, the world was a churning whiteness, the wind a low moan that rattled the window panes. Kaiser lay before the hearth, his head on his paws, but his ears twitched with every new gust. Martha sat at her small table, mending a tear in a canvas sack, her movements economical and sure. The storm was a wall, sealing her in. She felt no fear, only a quiet rightness. This was what she had prepared for. The cabin was stout, the firewood stacked high, and the pantry below was full. The world outside could rage. She had her own world, dug from the earth and sealed against all comers. For 3 days, the snow fell. It buried fences, drifted up to the eaves of cabins, and silenced the world. On the 4th day, the sun returned, a pale, distant disk in a white sky. The thaw that followed was a cruel trick. It lasted just long enough for the snow to melt into a heavy, wet slush, seeping into the poorly chinked walls of smokehouses and the shallow cellars of her neighbors. Then the temperature plummeted again, a final, brutal cold that locked the settlement in a sheath of ice. It was then that the rot, held in check by the initial freeze, began in earnest. Hams turned slick and green. Potatoes in damp bins sprouted mold. The thin layer of ice that formed over barrels of salted fish did not stop the decay beneath. The community's carelessness had been laid bare. And then, the first knock came at her door. It was a young woman, Mary, clutching a baby wrapped in a thin blanket. Her face was pinched with cold and fear. "Martha," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Our meat's gone bad. All of it. The baby, he ain't eaten proper in a day." Martha looked from the woman's desperate eyes to the child's pale face. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in by the fire." Mary was the first, but not the last. The next day, an old man named Henry, whose hands shook with a palsy, stood on her stoop, his pride a brittle thing in the face of an empty stomach. He offered to trade his last good axe for a sack of flour. Martha looked at the axe, then at his trembling hands. She went down into the cellar and came back with flour, and also a small jar of pickled beets. She took the axe. A tool was an honest trade. She would not accept charity, and she would not give it. She gave what was earned. News traveled quickly in the small, isolated settlement. The path to her door, at first a single track in the snow, was soon a beaten trail. They came with shamefaced looks and downcast eyes, the same people who had whispered behind their hands about the fat widow and her foolish hole in the ground. They brought what they had. A handful of shotgun shells. A tarnished silver locket. A promise of labor come spring. For each, she would descend into the earth and return with a carefully measured portion. Turnips for the locket. A slab of salt pork for the shells. Cornmeal for the promise of a mended fence. She kept a ledger in her mind, what was given, what was received. It was a cold accounting, but it was fair. Her pantry, once a monument to private grief, had become the settlement's beating heart. But with dependency came resentment. The whispers started again, different this time. Not of madness, but of hoarding. Of selfishness. They forgot their own mockery, their own lack of foresight. They saw her stores not as the result of her sweat and sorrow, but as a resource that rightfully belonged to the collective. And the man who gave voice to that resentment was Rector. He arrived at dusk, when the light was failing and the shadows grew long and sharp. He did not come alone. 2 other men from the settlement stood behind him, their faces grim, their hands shoved deep in their pockets. Rector smiled his thin, familiar smile. Kaiser stood beside Martha in the open doorway, the fur along his spine raised. A low growl was a constant, steady threat. "Mistress Martha," Rector began, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "A difficult time for us all. The Lord is testing our Christian charity." He gestured vaguely at the settlement, a collection of dark shapes huddled under the cold stars. "We have taken stock. There is not enough. Many of the children are hungry. It is not right that one household should have so much while others have so little." Martha's face was a stone mask in the lantern light. She did not speak. Her silence was a wall he had to climb. "We have agreed, as a community, to pool our resources," he continued, his tone hardening slightly. "For the good of all. We need to see what you have, so we can make a fair distribution." The word "affair" was a weapon in his mouth. "No," she said. The word was not loud, but it was absolute. It hung in the frozen air between them. Rector's smile tightened. "This is not a request, Martha. This is a matter of survival. The community's survival. You would not stand against your neighbors, surely." She looked past him, at the 2 men who would not meet her eyes. She saw their shame, and she saw their hunger, and she knew the hunger would win. "What is mine was earned," she said. "It is not for you to distribute." She made a move to close the door. Rector put a hand out to stop it. It was the first time he had ever touched her property. Kaiser's growl deepened, becoming a snarl. "Think carefully," Rector said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The night is long. And hungry men are not patient men." He took his hand away and stepped back. He did not need to say more. The threat was delivered. She closed the heavy oak door and slid the thick wooden bar into place. The sound of it seating in the iron brackets was a final, deafening sound in the quiet cabin. The siege had begun. She did not sleep. She sat in her chair by the cold hearth, the rifle across her lap. It had been Abrams. She knew how to load it, how to clean it, but she had never fired it at a living thing. Kaiser lay at her feet, a coiled spring of muscle and teeth, his eyes fixed on the door. The moon rose, casting a pale, unforgiving light across the snow, making the tracks of Rector's party stand out like dark wounds. The wind had died down, and the silence was absolute. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every pop of the cooling stove, sounded like a footstep. She thought of the food below. Of the labor. Of the grief that had been poured into the earth, bucket by bucket. It was more than food. It was the last thing of her husband she had left. It was the physical proof of her own survival. To give it up would be to let the second winter, the one in her soul, finally claim her. Sometime after midnight, she heard it. A faint crunch of snow. Then another. Kaiser was on his feet in an instant, a silent shadow moving to the door, his body low to the ground. Martha rose, her heart a slow, heavy drum in her chest. She cocked the rifle. The click was unnervingly loud in the stillness. She moved to the small window, peering out from behind the edge of the curtain. She saw them. Rector, and 4 others. One of them was a boy, Finn, no more than 14, holding a lantern that threw their shadows, long and monstrous, against the snow. They were carrying pry bars and a heavy mallet. They were not coming to ask again. She watched them approach, her breath held tight in her chest. They stopped a few yards from the cabin, their voices low murmurs she could not make out. Rector pointed to the door, then to the window. He was directing them. The boy, Finn, looked uneasy. He kept glancing back toward the settlement, as if hoping someone would call him back. But no one did. The world was asleep, or pretending to be. Rector stepped forward, his face illuminated by the lantern Finn held. The smile was gone. In its place was a hard, grim certainty. He was a man who had decided he was in the right, and that was the most dangerous kind of man there was. "Martha?" Rector's voice cut through the night. "Open this door. Do not make us do what we would rather not." Her only answer was the silence of the cabin. She heard the scrape of a pry bar against the door frame. The wood groaned in protest. Kaiser let out a single, sharp bark, a sound of pure fury. "Do it," Rector ordered. The sound of the mallet striking the door was a heavy, sickening thud. It shook the entire cabin. Thud. The wood splintered. Thud. A crack appeared near the latch. She moved away from the window, pressing her back against the interior wall, the rifle held tight against her shoulder. She would not shoot a man. She could not. But they did not know that. The door would not hold for long. She looked at the trap door to the pantry, its iron ring flush with the floorboards. Abram had made the door from 2 layers of oak, cross-grained for strength. He had built it to last. She lowered the rifle and moved to the trap door. With a grunt of effort, she heaved it open. The smell of cold earth filled the room. She pointed down. "Kaiser!" "Walk," she commanded, using the old word. "Guard." The dog looked at her, then down into the darkness of the cellar, and understood. He leaped down into the opening, landing silently on the dirt floor below. She then dragged the heavy kitchen table, a solid block of maple Abram had made, over the opening. It was not a perfect seal, but it would slow them down. The cabin door splintered, then burst inward with a crash of wood and a shower of snow. Rector stood in the doorway, the men behind him. They saw the empty room, the single lantern, and the woman standing alone. They saw the rifle in her hands, pointed not at them, but at the ceiling. "It is over, Martha," Rector said, taking a step inside. "Give us the food, it is under the floor," she said, her voice calm. "And it is guarded." Rector laughed, a short, ugly sound. He gestured to one of the men. "Get that table out of the way." The man hesitated, looking at the rifle. "She's bluffing," Rector snapped. "Move." The man stepped forward and put his hands on the table. From the darkness beneath it came a sound that was not animal. It was a low, guttural promise of violence that made the man snatch his hands back as if burned. "Kaiser!" They could not see him, but they could hear him. They could feel his presence in the cold air rising from the cellar. The boy, Finn, holding the lantern high, took an involuntary step back. He had seen what that dog could do to a fox. Rector's face contorted with rage. He had expected a weeping widow, not this cold defiance. He took another step into the room. "I will not ask again." She finally lowered the rifle, until it was pointing directly at his chest. Her hands were perfectly steady. "You have what you came for," she said, her voice flat. "You broke my door. You will not break anything else." For a long, stretched moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the ragged breathing of the men and the deep, menacing rumble from beneath the floor. Finn looked from Rector's furious face to Martha's calm, resolute one. He saw no fear in her. He saw only a thing that would not be moved. It was Rector who broke first. The threat of the dog was one thing. The certainty in the woman's eyes was another. He was not a man willing to die for a sack of potatoes. He backed out of the doorway, pulling the others with him. "This is not over," he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. They retreated into the night, their shadows shrinking as they went. Finn was the last to leave. He paused in the broken doorway and looked at her, his young face a mixture of fear and something like awe. Then he turned and ran, the lantern bobbing wildly in the darkness. Martha stood unmoving until their footsteps faded. Only then did she lower the rifle. She went to the table and called the dog. Kaiser leaped out of the cellar, his duty done. She barred the shattered door as best she could with a heavy chest of drawers and sat back down in her chair, the cold from the broken doorway seeping into the room. She had won. But the cabin felt colder than ever. The storm broke 2 days later. The sun shone with a weak but genuine warmth, and the great silence over the settlement was broken by the sounds of men digging out. The immediate crisis of the blizzard was over, but the moral winter remained. No one came to her door. The path that had been beaten by the desperate was now covered in a fresh layer of undisturbed snow. She was more alone than she had been before. She worked to repair her door, her hands clumsy with the cold. It was a crude fix, but it would hold. On the third day after the attack, she saw movement. It was the boy, Finn. He was walking toward her cabin, pulling a small sled behind him. On it was a single, well-dried log of oak. He walked with his head down, not stopping until he reached her stoop. He did not knock. He simply set the log down beside the broken doorframe, turned without a word, and walked away. Martha watched him go. She looked at the log, a silent offering. An apology. A beginning. She opened her patch door, went down into the cellar, and came back with 2 large potatoes. She walked out to the path he had made and set them in the middle of his tracks, where he would be sure to find them on his way back. It was not forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement. A recognition that community was not built on demands, but on exchanges. Later that day, Mary, the young mother, came. She stood a dozen feet from the door, not daring to come closer. "He told us," she said, her voice small. "Finn. He told us what Rector did. What you did." She held out a small, carved bird, whittled from a piece of scrap wood. "It's all I have." Martha looked at the bird, then at the woman. She went inside and returned with a small sack of cornmeal and a single onion. She took the offered carving. The exchanges had begun again, but the currency was different now. It was laced with shame and a new, fragile respect. They were rebuilding something, slowly, piece by painful piece. Come spring, when the ground had softened, the work truly began. It was Finn who came first, axe in hand. "My father says I'm to help you. Mend your door proper." And other things. He would not look her in the eye, but his hands were ready. Martha nodded and pointed him to the woodpile. Others followed. The men who had stood behind Rector now came with offerings of labor, their faces stiff with unspoken apologies. They helped her build a new, stronger door. They mended her fence. They cleared the last of the deep drifts from her yard. One day, Henry, the old man, came and asked her about the cellar. "The wife, she's afraid of another winter like that one," he said, his gaze fixed on the ground. You'd show me? How to dig one proper?" She did not answer with words. She led him to the trapdoor and opened it, letting him feel the chill air rise up. She handed him her lantern and let him descend the ladder to see the stone-lined walls, the sturdy shelves, the deep, secure cold. When he came back up, his eyes were wide. He had seen not just a pantry, but a promise. She did not teach them with lectures or instructions. She showed them. She took a shovel and walked to the north side of Henry's cabin, the place where the shadows were longest. She drove the shovel into the earth and showed him how to read the soil, to look for the deep clay that would hold the shape. Soon, other men joined, watching in silence. They saw the way she braced the walls with timber before the stone was laid. They saw how she understood ventilation, digging a narrow shaft packed with stones to allow the air to move without letting in the warmth. Her pantry, once a symbol of her isolation, became their blueprint for survival. They began to call it the widow's way. Years passed. The settlement grew, cabins giving way to clapboard houses with stone foundations. And beneath every house, there was a cellar, dug deep and lined with stone, cool in the summer and safe in the winter. The story of the siege winter became a kind of founding myth, told by the fire on long, cold nights. They told of the widow who dug her grief into the ground and pulled up survival. They spoke of Rector, who had left the settlement in shame not long after, unable to bear the weight of their silent judgment. They told of the boy who made the first offering of peace, and of the 2 potatoes left in the snow. Martha grew old. Her hair turned the color of the winter sky. Her broad frame stooped, but her hands remained strong. She was no longer an outcast. She had become something else. She was the bedrock. The children of the settlement, who had never known the hunger of that first, terrible winter would bring her the first fruits of their gardens. Not as charity, but as tribute. They would leave jars of honey and fresh-baked bread on her stoop, and she would leave a perfectly ripe tomato or a crisp apple in its place. The exchange continued. The legend became an object, the object became an act, and the act became the way they lived. They were a community forged not by a preacher's words or a leader's ambition, but by the quiet, unyielding competence of a woman they had once scorned. Her pantry was no longer just hers. It was in the earth beneath all their feet, a shared foundation, a silent promise dug deep against the cold.